For several centuries, millennia even, multiple ancient cultures all over the world have left stories about strange creatures coming from the skies. Some of them were friendly and helped humanity progress, while others were terrible and brought death and destruction. Are any of these stories true? Do aliens exist? Has the planet been visited by flying saucers transporting creatures from outer space? Well, just stay here and find out, because my dear friends, today we're going to talk about the history of UFOs and extraterrestrial beings. Now, let's be clear, here at The Rest is History, we believe that UFOs are either fakes or else sightings of secret air technology. At the same time, we also believe that there is extraterrestrial life somewhere in this vast universe, but we very much doubt that humans have ever come in contact with it. Although we don't want to close any doors completely, we have to be realistic and realize that the possibility that there has been contact with real aliens but it has somehow been kept secret seems extremely unlikely. However, as total science fiction geeks, this topic fascinates us. Plus, it's also lots of fun and very interesting to learn where some of these outlandish ideas came from. Basically, we found ourselves an excuse to geek out on aliens. So hold on to your tinfoil hats and let's begin. We'll start with our distant past. There are many hypotheses regarding ancient astronauts, according to which, a long time ago, Earth was visited by aliens who helped the human cultures of those times in their development. These stories maintain that several ancient megalithic constructions were built by extraterrestrials, and that many sacred texts were actually the naive and primitive accounts of those initial contacts with creatures from another world. For example, just have a look at the cover of the sarcophagus of Pakal the Great, king of the Mayans of Palenque. Wouldn't you say it represents an alien sitting on some sort of jet-propelled spaceship? Well, in 1968, that is exactly what a man named Erich von Daniken wrote in his book Chariots of the Gods. In it, he argued that the pyramids of Egypt, the Mayan ziggurats, Stonehenge, and the lines of Nazca must have been works of aliens, because ancient humans were, a bunch of useless morons according to von Daniken. However, thanks to translated Mayan writings, we know that this engraving depicts their king, alongside various well-known hieroglyphic motifs, such as the flame of the underworld and the sacred tree of the Mayan mythology, known as Waka-chan. This sacred tree idea is a mytheme or an archetype that can be found in hundreds of cultures throughout the world, just like sun worships through solar gods. Von Daniken thought that these artistic and religious coincidences were due to the fact that all these cultures had a common origin. Of course, those common origins were aliens. But in reality, worshipping the sun or the trees or mythologizing floods is a common occurrence because every single culture on Earth has viewed the sun as a source of life. They have all mythologized the fauna and flora surrounding them because they provided the sustenance, and they have all suffered periods of terrible climates and floods. Therefore, it makes perfect sense that human cultures will coincide in creating myths surrounding these issues. Talking of floods, let's mention one of the most famous theories regarding ancient astronauts. According to the apocryphal Book of Enoch, which extends the Bible's Genesis, God was an alien who had 200 minions, the angels, who were also aliens and known as watchers because they were in charge of keeping an eye on us stupid humans. But some of these angels disobeyed God and got frisky with human women, giving rise to the Nephilim, whom according to certain translations were some kind of giants. When God found out about this, he was furious. He rounded up all the watchers and sent a great flood to destroy the Nephilim and the humans, who by that point had received too much forbidden knowledge from the fallen angels. However, one of his still loyal angels, Uriel, was sent to warn Noah about the incoming deluge, and he managed to survive by building a huge ark. If you know about Greek mythology, this will sound extremely familiar, as it's basically the story of Zeus's flood and Deucalion's wooden chest, which we covered in a previous video. Von Daniken even said that the destruction of Sodom was carried out by aliens using thermonuclear weapons from another galaxy. And also that, in the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, this prophet had a vision of history's first UFO, since it tells how he saw floating shiny balls and winged humanoid beings. That said, if you actually read the text, it turns out it's all extremely ambiguous, just like the famous apocalypse, which we also covered in a previous video. And just to finish off, apparently Jesus too was an alien, who was brought to Earth in a flying saucer seen as the Star of Bethlehem by the wise Magi from the East, and was left here as a baby to save humanity. It's unclear why they didn't choose a grown-up. Next up, we have Zecharia Sitchin, famous for taking Sumerian and Babylonian texts like Enuma Elish and Atrahasis and translating them not very rigorously, it must be said, to come up with a narrative worthy of its own anime series. Roughly speaking, he said that the Mesopotamian gods were the children of primal god Anu, the Anunnaki, and linked them to Nephilim of Genesis. According to Sitchin, they came from the planet Nibiru, seeking to take all the gold on Earth. The Anunnaki then created Homo sapiens through genetic engineering to use us as slaves for gold mining.
You'll be my slave.
At this point, there is plenty of confusion with stories told by David Icke and Anton Parks, two guys who talked about the type of aliens known as reptilians, but we'll get into that a bit later. First, we have to mention Robert Temple, who said that a West African tribe, the Dogon people of Mali, had been in contact with extraterrestrials for the past 5,000 years, and that is the reason why they have accurate astronomical information about the star Sirius B. According to Temple, the Dogon believe that Sirius is the home of a half-amphibious race which used to gather a long time ago at the nearby lake. They also knew that Sirius was a triple star system, which is something that wasn't discovered until 1995. In 1976, Temple explained all his theories in the book The Sirius Mystery, which is highly recommended for fertilizing lawns. But they were swiftly refuted by Carl Sagan in Broca's Brain, which basically argued that this business about Sirius and the Dogons came from the misinterpretation of French anthropologist Marcel Griol. And just to top it off, subsequent researchers who have worked with the Dogon tribe say that they have never even heard these people talk about Sirius or anything like that.
So it was all for nothing.
Did you know that there is also a hieroglyphic in the Temple of Abydos showing a combat helicopter, Luke Skywalker's X-Wing, and the spaceship from Futurama? No, you didn't, because in reality it's all due to the superposition of 2 or 3 symbols causing pareidolia, which is a psychological phenomenon whereby our brains link any unexplained image with something that we're familiar with, even if it's completely unrelated. If you look closely at this image, you can see that there are several superimposed symbols generating those images. It's not magic, it's just pure coincidence.
Coincidence? I think not!
Okay, and what about the aliens we can find in the tomb of the Great Vizier Ptahhotep? Sorry, those are not aliens, but flower vases, or perhaps bunches of grapes as we can see in other representations. And now, let's make something crystal clear. The pyramids are not built by aliens using anti-gravitational UFOs. Saying that is extremely unfair to the cultures that came before us, who instead deserve plenty of credit. In our other videos on ancient history, you can clearly see the progression from the constructions of the first temples, mastabas and pyramids. Some of the initial pyramid structures didn't work out really well and eventually collapsed, but they slowly learned and improved. And while it may be true that we still don't know all the details about the building techniques, they are undoubtedly human constructions. What many of these pseudo-scientific and sensationalist authors are doing is exploiting gaps in our knowledge of certain cultures, dark periods in their historical and archaeological records to say X things was created by aliens.
Yeah. Well, whenever you notice something like that, a wizard did it.
And although we like to call them historical plot holes, that doesn't mean that they won't get resolved at some point in the future. Perhaps some sort of archaeological DLC. Then again, perhaps we'll never have an answer to certain questions about our past. But such is life. What we can't do is blame everything we don't understand on little green creatures, or grey ones, I don't know.
The Moors of Easter Island? Clearly aliens. The Dogo statues from Japanese prehistory? Oh man, haven't you seen those huge eyes? Those are aliens, no doubt about it. The autumn birds of the Kimbawa culture? Those are spaceships, dude. The petroglyphs of the Anasazi culture? What, you gonna tell me the Anasazi didn't know how to draw humans? Hello? Aliens.
Okay, seriously now, call me crazy, but the simplest explanation is usually the right one. Many of these objects are known as OPARTs, which stands for out-of-place artifacts. This means that they appear to be very advanced in regard to the age in which they are dated. In reality, this topic deserves its own video, but for now we'll stick to UFOs. If we get enough requests in the comments, maybe one day we'll talk about OPARTs. According to some fans of ancient astronauts, several old Hindu texts like the Rig Veda or the Ramayana also talk about UFOs. The artifacts they mention are actually called Vimanas, and in Hindu mythology they were flying carriages used by the gods. But that's the same as saying Apollo's chariot was a UFO. Then we must also consider that many of these representations in drawings and such are quite recent. Moving on, most representations of vaguely humanoid figures with round head and large eyes have been interpreted as a sign of alien presence, like the cave paintings of Tassili Najer in Algeria, the Wandjina rock paintings in Australia, or the ones in Val Camonica in Italy, and of course the figure waving hello in the lines of Nazca, Peru. Hello there! In addition, elongated craniums are usually considered a clear sign of alienness, as we see in the representation of Pharaoh Akhenaton and his wife Nefertiti, and in multiple skulls belonging to the inhabitants of ancient Peru. In the case of Akhenaton, this might have been a simple question of fashion, like Instagram filters nowadays, while some ancient Peruvian cultures such as the Panacas and the Nazca used to bind babies' head to wooden planks in order to elongate them, in the same way as certain cultures nowadays circumcise children, elongate necks, extend lips, blacken teeth, bind feet, and so on. So the conclusion is that whenever a head's shape deviates from the norm, no matter how slightly, someone is bound to call alien! Honestly, all this paleoastronautics malarkey is simply an attempt to fill the gaps of historical knowledge. Here's the thing though, when alien lovers fill those gaps with explanation that aliens help us to evolve, they then create new questions like, how did those aliens achieve their own evolution and progress? So in the end, they are just simply wild theories that seek to fill gaps by creating even larger gaps. And now, let's move forward all the way up to the Middle Ages. During this period, the big deal, particularly in Europe, were fantastic creatures like fairies, nymphs, goblins, elves, dwarves, and so on. Many of these beings had a penchant for kidnapping people, and that led a Frenchman named Jacques Vallée to conclude that such tales were the way in which medieval people explained strange disappearances in the villages or forests, and which of course were none other than alien abductions.
All fits a profile of alien abduction.
It is said that in the year 776, during the Saxon siege of Sigeberg, the soldiers saw some sort of flaming discs in the sky. And in 842, we have reports of unidentified flying objects in the French city of Angers. In these two cases, there really isn't too much information to go by. Maybe they were meteorites or perhaps just collective hallucination, which is something that we should never rule out. Let's remember that Constantine the Great swore he saw a cross flying in the sky before a great battle, and that's why he had his soldiers paint crosses on their shields. One curious story is the legend of the Green Children of Woolpit. Apparently, around the year 1100, the inhabitants of this English village found two kids trapped in a pit and rescued them. The unusual thing is that they were both green, spoke an unintelligible tongue, and only ate green vegetables. The boy died soon afterwards, but the girl eventually began to eat meat, and soon her green color faded. She also learned the local language and explained that she came from a faraway place where everybody was green, so clearly she was an alien. Except that there are also various theories that can explain this. For starters, the kids may have suffered chlorosis, a rare anemic condition that makes the skin turn greenish. Then, they may have belonged to Brighton tribes, which lived in hidden caves, spoke an ancient Celtic dialect, and used to decorate their bodies with different war paints. And then of course, this may all be a tall tale that someone made up after a liquid lunch and then got passed around.
Have you been drinking?
In the realm of art, we have a fresco from 1350 entitled The Crucifixion in the Visoki Dekani Monastery in Kosovo. The painting skies shows two objects that could be meteorites, except that they have people inside, so they are pointed to as spaceships. However, everything indicates that they are personified representations of the sun and the moon. As it turns out, this was a relatively common representation in Orthodox Christianity. For example, we can also see it in the crucifixion of Karanli Kumbet in Turkey. Up next, there are some Independence Day style spaceships. These come from an altar piece entitled The Foundation of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, painted by Masolino in 1428. What it actually shows is an event which took place in 358. Not an alien invasion, but an extremely unusual snowfall which led Pope Liberius to found that basilica. Other clouds represented around the same time are very similar, not realistic but stylized, like these by Benozzo Gozzoli, because that was the fashion back then. And now, let's talk about the modern age. The best known event supposedly connected to UFOs at this time are the celestial phenomenons over Nuremberg, which took place in 1561 in Germany, and the celestial phenomenons over Basel, observed in Switzerland in 1566. In this case, the inhabitants of those two cities saw many black spheres and cylinders moving erratically around the skies at great speeds. Some of them then turned red and disappeared. This was reported by newspapers at the time, which included an engraving by Hans Galser, and according to the testimonies, it appeared to be an aerial battle. Oh, and after all this action, a large black triangular object fell out from the skies among clouds of smoke. Alright, so what explanation does all this have? Well, for some people this was a meteor shower, while others believe they were an optical phenomena like the halo, the anthelion, the parhelion, or Megan Thee Stallion at the Met Gala. Or perhaps it could have been an electrical storm, or some form of religious collective hysteria. Back then, any unusual meteorological event was attributed to divine punishment. If in old antiquity such phenomena gave rise to all sorts of mythologies, it isn't a far stretch to think that at this time they were still considered to represent the will of some deity or another. Consider that people back in the day didn't understand science and climate like we do nowadays. From the modern age, we also have multiple paintings showing objects that many have interpreted to have an extraterrestrial origin. So let's go over some examples. In Paolo Uccello's The Debate from 1460, we see a red UFO next to Jesus Christ. Except that isn't really a UFO, but a cardinal's galero with its ties and ribbons. It turns out that the figure standing next to Jesus in the cave is Saint Hieronymus or Girolamo, who became a hermit after renouncing his ecclesiastic position, and this is represented by the abandoned headpiece on the ground. The Annunciation with Saint Edimus is an Italian altarpiece by Carlo Crivelli, and here we can see a beam of light coming from the sky. This isn't particularly mysterious because the theme is the conception of Mary by the Holy Spirit. In this Madonna from the late 15th century, attributed either to Tonno Miller or Sebastiano Mainardi, we can see something that looks like a UFO in the background. According to the experts, that is simply the symbolism of the Star of Annunciation. Sometimes angels had an anthropomorphic shape, and others were represented as shining clouds. We can see something similar in the work The Baptism of Christ by Dutch artist Arend de Gelder from 1710. Wait a minute, is that UFO trying to abduct Jesus and John the Baptist? Nah, come on. Once again, that's the Holy Spirit. You can even see the sacred dove there. And that's normal, because at the time it was customary to represent the Holy Spirit as an intangible divine force, as well as a dove. The divine nature was highlighted by painting a luminous halo or something as a solar disk. Recall the god Aton in the Egyptian Amarna period, as well as several other solar deities. Now, without a doubt, the most famous painting in terms of ufology conspiracies is the glorification of the Eucharist by Ventura Salimbeni from the 1600s, to the point that some people even refer to it as Salimbeni's Sputnik, because the central object seems to be a Soviet satellite. So is that object really a satellite that wouldn't be built until 350 years later? Of course not. What we see here is our world's globe representing creation, with God and Jesus drawing the meridians and the parallels. Those aren't antennae, they're paintbrushes, or divine scepters like some people say, and that element that seems to be the satellite's camera lens is actually the supporting stand. If we look at the Trinity of Saint Sepulchre in Jerusalem, we can see the same concept. It's also featured in Jan Provost's Christian Allegory, and that's not the only example, there are actually hundreds more. And so, we've reached the 19th century. Between the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution, humanity began to understand this world of ours a little bit better. Plenty of new theories that explained our origin, like those of Darwin's and others, became widely popular. But staying on the alien theme, we have French astronomer Camille Flammarion, who in his work The Plurality of Inhabited Worlds, published in 1862, was the first to deal with the idea of extraterrestrial life from a scientific perspective. At the time, this idea started to gain momentum because some astronomers like Giovanni Schiaparelli began to observe Mars through telescopes and spied some sort of canals on the surface, leading them to conclude that these were artificial, probably roads or something like that. And although it was later discovered that these were optical illusions caused by the lenses of their instruments, the idea that Mars was inhabited popularized the term Martian. Towards the end of the century, spiritualism became very fashionable. People believed that certain mediums were able to communicate with their deceased loved ones as well as creatures from other planets. All this began with a Theosophical Society, founded in New York by Madame Helena Blavatsky. She combined Occidental philosophy, Hinduist doctrines which she didn't really understand, and spiritualism, and then went around saying that when someone died, their soul could be reincarnated in another creature on Earth. This then led to occultists from the age to conclude the existence of sentient races all over the universe. For example, Helena Smith, a medium from Geneva, recalled having been reincarnated as Marie Antoinette, a Hindu princess from the 15th century and a visitor from Mars. Meanwhile, medium Vesta La Viesta said that she communicated with various aliens through astral projection. Whether they knew something the rest of us don't, or they were so high on laudanum that they don't even remember what they ate for breakfast, is up to you to decide. And lastly, we have to mention the famous occultist Aleister Crowley, who along with the Theosophical Society was a precursor of the hippies and the New Age movement, combining things like spiritualism, occultism, neo-paganism, mysticism, shamanism, and a really long etc. The story goes that in 1917, Crowley was contacted by an entity from another world called Lam. He made some drawings of these beings, and what a coincidence! It's very similar to the prototype of grey alien we know since the 60s. According to Crowley, these were transdimensional beings who sought out to open communication portals in order to help humanity progress towards a new age. This pseudo-spiritualism was the start of a movement which then gathered momentum and led to most of the stories we nowadays associate with aliens and UFOs. Not surprisingly though, this was jumbled up with several other strange ideas and misconceptions that we will also mention.
You don't believe in conspiracy theories?
But first, we have to talk about the famous wave of mystery airships from 1896 to 1897. If you're not familiar with this story, in those years people began to spot a lot of UFOs, mainly in the western USA, particularly in San Francisco, although there were also some cases on the East Coast. The interesting part is that the report didn't mention flying saucers, but rather mysterious dirigibles and zeppelins flying over the night sky, spotting lights and giant wings. Some reporters did mention the hypothesis of extraterrestrial origins, and even concluded that they must have come from Mars, picking up the trails of his Schiaparelli and his canals, but these were really isolated cases. Nevertheless, it is commonly thought that these were the cultural predecessors of modern UFO sightings, and as you can see, UFOs and aliens have adopted different forms in each age and culture. Few years later, real zeppelins start to appear as relatively common transport vehicles, and slowly became widespread until the infamous incident of the Hindenburg in 1937, because it's true that these contraptions were very dangerous. One theory says that these sightings were the test flights of real Zeppelin prototypes, and that makes quite a lot of sense, given that the American inventor Solomon Andrews had already tried flying devices floating around his Arion in 1863. To this, we must add the exaggerated reporting of the yellow press at the time, which wasted no time in gathering eyewitness accounts from people who swore that they have seen occupants of those aircraft, and of course they were sure they came from Mars. In the early 20th century, there were also several reports of mysterious aircraft crossing the skies of New England, New Zealand and different places in Europe, but everything points to private Zeppelin flights. As we said, these vehicles were becoming quite common. We must also take into account that science fiction literature was booming at the time. Jules Verne and H.G. Wells had already mentioned submarines and aerial machines in their stories, which only existed in their imaginations. And of course, we cannot fail to mention the uber-famous novel The War of the Worlds. So let's get into that now. This book from English author H.G. Wells was published in 1898, and as far as we're aware, it was the first to depict Martians invading our planet. That is, Martians as evil creatures wanted to enslave us. Fortunately, despite their technological superiority, the Martians were defeated by an Earth virus. You see, Wells was a staunch believer in Darwinism, which says that it isn't necessarily the strongest creature that survives in a new environment, but rather those who are best adapted to it, and that is what he sought to portray in his novel. Just 40 years later, in 1938, a young aspiring actor named Orson Welles, who worked in the Mercury Theatre, decided to adapt the story into a radiophonic serial on CBS. Now, the key point is that he decided to make it more realistic by narrating it in news format. And so, although the program began with a warning that it was a work of fiction, many people who turned in halfway through were completely shocked. This led to scenes of mayhem both in New York and New Jersey, as citizens panicked believing that there was really an alien invasion taking place. After the fun and games and collective hysteria was over, Orson Welles was forced to publicly apologize. But then again, the incident launched his career, and soon after that he went to work on masterpieces like Citizen Kane. So it was all good.
Well, I guess we're just lucky nobody got hurt.
In contrast, Radio Quito, an Ecuadorian radio station which also adapted The War of Wolves in 1949, didn't fare quite as well. It seems that the jokers there had intended to mess with their audience a little bit, but some listeners didn't find it funny at all, to the point that they attacked their station, even setting it on fire, and 5 people were killed in the ensuing chaos.
Somebody's idea of a sick joke.
From the 30s, we should also mention Jack Parsons, an American rocket scientist and avid follower of our friend Crowley the occultist. This man sought to conceive a baby, with his wife, by means of a special magic ritual. The expectation was that the baby, whom they named Babylon, would eventually become a messiah figure and usher a new age. Parsons told his wife that they would soon start seeing signs in the sky, cigar-shaped objects which he actually didn't consider to be UFOs, but rather interdimensional signals and manifestations. Incidentally, this Parsons chap was a close friend of Lafayette Ronald Hubbard, better known as the founder of Scientology. At that time, science fiction was becoming extremely popular in the USA, and it appears that it stimulated the imaginations of many who began to believe in extraterrestrial life. And then of course, these stories served a big role as escapism, following the massive trauma of World War II. In 1939, Europe was plunged into absolute chaos with the start of World War II. Soon afterwards, the United States joined the conflict following the Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor in 1941. We mention this because throughout the war, many military pilots, particularly British, reported seeing shiny spheres flying around them. Luckily for those pilots, the UFOs never attacked. They simply accompanied the aircraft for a while and then vanished like a fart in a gale. These phenomena were soon nicknamed Foo Fighters, and the Allies thought they might be some sort of Nazi secret weapon. Ironically enough, the Nazis also viewed these reports as evidence of a secret weapon, but a British one. The most commonly accepted theory is that those pilots witnessed ball lightning, a rare phenomenon associated to electrical storms which is not well understood to this day. Another explanation is that it may have been an optical effect similar to St. Elmo's fire, or perhaps light reflecting from ice crystals, or enemy spy probes seen from the distance, or the shiny souls of golden retrievers ascending to puppy heaven. The point is, nobody really knows for sure. Another interesting rumor circulating at the time was the one about gremlins, evil creatures that sabotage aircrafts and other machinery. This story became very popular in the RAF to the point that children's author Roald Dahl, himself a fighter pilot, turned into a book, which later Walt Disney planned to turn into a film. Although the project was cancelled, the idea remained and was later used in the TV series The Twilight Zone, the Gremlins film saga, and several other examples. But let's stay with the Nazis for now, because that lot indulged in several mad theories related to UFOs and extraterrestrials. As you probably know, many of the Nazi top brass were completely obsessed with esoteric business, and formed secret organizations like the Thule Society and the Brill Society, which exalted Aryan superiority and that kind of rubbish. Can't stand intolerant people. Among such societies, it's worth highlighting the Anunnaki, a pseudo-scientific, educational and archaeological organization which sought to investigate these types of subjects. It was this same Anunnaki that financed Heinrich Himmler and Ernst Schaeffer's 1938 expedition to the Tibetan Himalayas in search of the origins of the Germanic race and the last remains of the Shambhala, as we mentioned in our video on Atlantis. In fact, some of these people were convinced that the predecessors had come from another planet, or from a superior race which ruled the world in ancient times.
Madness, mass hysteria, delusion.
In addition, they also explored the Antarctic in 1938, specifically the region of Queen Maud's Land. With what purpose, I hear you ask? Well, conspiracy theorists believe that they were attempting to build a secret base for UFOs, but it's far more likely that they were seeking a location for a whaling station in order to increase the whale oil production, which was still used as a fuel at the time. Now, moving forward to the end of the war, in 1947, the US conducted Operation High Jump, which involved military training maneuvers near Antarctica. The rumors say that the real objective was to destroy the last remaining strongholds of the Nazi UFOs in the frozen continent. But wait a minute, did the Nazis actually have the necessary technology to create UFOs? Well, no, not really. But they certainly made huge technological leaps with jet aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me-262 and also with the rockets like the legendary V-2 ballistic missile. And we must also mention the Horten HO-229, a prototype developed by the Horten brothers, which was the first jet-propelled flying wing. Remember that name, because it will come up later again. Perhaps the coolest myth of all is the Bell, or Die Glocke, a supposed top-secret Nazi device featuring an anti-gravity engine that allowed it to fly around like a typical UFO. Unfortunately for those conspiracy theorists, it seems that it was all just a pipe dream, concocted by Polish author Igor Wikowski. For their part, the Americans also played around with a few experimental aircrafts, like this disc-shaped one called Vought V173, also known as the Flying Pancake, and its successor, the Vought XF5U, the Flying Flapjack. And although they had a very limited run, it is believed that the flight test may have originated many UFO eyewitness reports. After the war, the Soviets and the Americans captured many Nazi scientists in what was known as Operation Paperclip. The main name here is Werner von Braun, the German engineer responsible for the V-2 who collaborated in the Apollo project to send the first manned mission to the moon. By the 1940s, science fiction was all the rage, not so much in cinema but certainly in radio, literature and pulp magazines like Amazing Stories. In 1945, this publication, edited by Raymond Palmer, included a story by a certain Richard Schaefer entitled I Remember remember Lemuria. It featured a powerful prehistoric civilization which built highly advanced cities in deep caverns and spoke a proto-human language called Man tongue. Now, these lot had trouble with the solar radiation bathing the Earth, so they abandoned the planet, leaving behind the descendants, the Terros, who then degenerated into sadistic creatures called Deros, who in turn kidnapped humans to torture and eat them, and also used mysterious beams to cause nightmares and schizophrenia. According to Schaeffer's fiction, the Deros still abduct people occasionally, in the underground or sewer system, which is why you shouldn't organize picnics there. The story was very successful and launched amazing stories. Another important magazine at the time was Weird Tales, focused primarily on fantasy and terror, and which is famous for publishing H.P. Lovecraft's first stories. This American author was mostly unknown by the time he died in 1937, but afterwards his friends and a small group of followers, many whom were also writers, founded the publisher Arkham House and published his works throughout the 1940s. This was the beginning of the cosmic horror literature, a new subgenre which moved away from ghost stories and satanic rituals to include elements connected to ancient races, monsters, and other dimensions. Many of these stories were part of the Cthulhu mythos, named after the famous alien monster Cthulhu, or Cthulhu, or Thulu, or however the heck you pronounce that name. Returning to UFOs, in 1945 we also have the incident of Flight 19, when 5 American bomber planes mysteriously disappeared near the coast of Florida. There was some radio interference, apparently the compass went crazy, and then puff, they disappeared and were never seen again. To make matters worse, a Mariner flying boat which was sent as a search and rescue operation blew up mid-air, leaving no survivors. This was the origin of the Bermuda Triangle myth. Some said that underneath the maritime area there was an alien base which shot down any planes or sunk any ships that came too close, but in reality it isn't much of a mystery, considering that the area has some of the densest sea and air traffic in the world. Accidents are statistically bound to happen. Specifically, the incident of Flight 19 could be explained as a human error by Lieutenant Charles Taylor, who may have lost his heading and realized his mistake too late, causing the aircraft to run out of fuel somewhere over the Atlantic. This type of unexplained aviation incidents were relatively common back then, since they didn't have any advanced radar technology as we do nowadays.
Yes, I love technology.
On the 24th of June of 1947, we have what is considered as the first modern sighting of an unidentified flying object. We're talking about the case of Kenneth Arnold, a private pilot who, while flying over Mount Rainier in the US state of Washington, reported seeing 9 strange objects crossing the sky. Arnold estimated their speed at around 2,000 kilometers per hour and described them as kitchen plates, which led to the famous idea of the flying saucers. But let me ask you something. That shape, kind of like a boomerang, doesn't it remind you of something? Remember the horse and flying wing we talked about earlier? Just saying. And talking about flying saucers, we should make it clear that Arnold never actually described them as such. What he said was that they were shaped as a half moon and they moved like saucers skipping over water. This statement was misreported by a journalist named Bill Beckett, and what a coincidence. From that point onwards, the majority of UFOs sighted were shaped as flying saucers. Hey, but who knows? Perhaps the aliens decided to redesign the spaceships to fit the reporter's mistake. After this, Kenneth Arnold became relatively famous and took part in several investigations to confirm the veracity of different eyewitness accounts from people who swore that had also seen or been in contact with UFOs. Raymond Palmer published the story in Amazing Stories and even sent Arnold as a reporter to the Maury Islands south of Seattle, where 2 harbor patrolmen said that they had seen 6 donut-shaped UFOs which had dropped some metal fragments next to them. Arnold interviewed 2 military officers from the US Air Force who had examined the metallic objects. They reported that they were just pieces of aluminium and that it all seemed like a hoax. The thing is that a few days later, those 2 same officers, Frank Brown and William Davidson, died when their return flight to California crashed.
What a coincidence!
Nevertheless, the FBI concluded that the whole thing had been a setup by a private company in Tacoma, aimed at scaring people who owned vacation homes in the region so they could hire their services. In addition, one of the 2 patrolmen, Harold Dahl, said that he received a visit from a strange man in a dark suit telling him to forget all about the affair. This in turn popularized the idea of the Men in Black, supposed secret government agents whose mission is to cover any incident related to UFOs and aliens.
You know what the difference is between you and me? I make this look good.
In the following weeks, reports of UFO sightings all over the USA began to flood in, possibly due to collective hysteria as well as pranksters and people who wanted to make money with the fad. Among these, we can mention the Twin Falls flying saucer hoax, which took place in Idaho. In this case, some locals said that they had retrieved a small flying saucer about 2.5 feet in diameter. That's 75 centimeters for the rest of the world. But when the FBI turned up to investigate the case, a group of teenagers confessed that they had made it all up. Naughty, naughty. And with this, we reach the super famous Roswell Incident, which took place on the 2nd of July 1947, barely 1 month after Kenneth Arnold saw his UFO. The story goes that on that day, a UFO crashed at a ranch in New Mexico. The owner, a farmer named William McBrazel, witnessed the explosion and then discovered signs of metallic wreckage near the site. He called the sheriff, who in return notified the army, and then next thing you know, the entire area was cordoned off. As expected, the local newspapers had a field day with this, particularly the Roswell Daily Record, which said that a flying saucer had been captured, and the news spread like wildfire. It was even reported that the authorities had retrieved the bodies of 3 humanoid creatures. According to the official version, Brazel's description were consistent with scientific balloons used in the US at the time, mainly to study the weather, but also to spy on the Soviet Union. Let's not forget that this was at the time of the Cold War. In the 1990s, when some secret material was declassified, some investigations said that the incident was connected to the 4th flight of Project Mogul, a top-secret project which sought to use high-altitude balloons to gather information about the Soviet Union and the nuclear weapons test. This idea does make sense, given that Roswell was right in the middle of several testing areas. At White Sands, they experimented with German V-2 missiles. Oppenheimer's Manhattan Project was conducted at the premises of Los Alamos, and the desert of Alamogordo witnessed the first nuclear explosion in history at the Trinity site on July 1945. Incidentally, some theories say that the same first nuclear explosion was the signal that alerted nearby aliens of humanity's development, and that ever since then they have been spying on us, keeping an eye on our technological progress and construction of future weapons. Rumor has it that they are subscribed to this channel, so perhaps you want to leave them a message in the comment section. Anyway, back to Roswell. Logically, the US government had more than enough reasons to raise a smokescreen in this case. First, they tried to stop all the publications about the affair, but when they realized people were saying that this was clearly some alien business, they decided to let the story spread, and perhaps even promote them covertly, as this was the best outcome for them. They would rather have public attention distracted with conspiracy theories and flying saucers than discussing the truth, military devices to spy on Russia. And so, the Roswell Incident became a big legend in the world of ufology. Most of the common archetypes and themes about the subject originated here. You name it. The government hiding extraterrestrial technology, Men in Black, the development of ultra-advanced weapons, the X-Files, the truth is out there, and a long, long list. That is how Roswell grew into the spiritual capital of the UFO lore, with museums, themed bars, merchandising, and anything you can imagine.
These people need love.
Later in 1995, a video recording appeared which supposedly showed the autopsy of one of the aliens who died in Roswell. I was a small boy at the time, but I remember being totally dumbstruck when this was mentioned in the news. Disappointingly, it was eventually discovered to be a hoax orchestrated by an Englishman named Ray Santilli. This smartass created the clip and then sold it to various TV outlets around the world for a lot of money, but eventually he admitted the fraud in 2006.
Illegal alien autopsy.
As the kerfuffle concerning UFOs reached fever pitch, the US government realized that it was time to get a grip on things. What they did was create the Wright-Patterson Air Base in Ohio, where they run multiple projects and investigate UFO cases all over the country following a well-established protocol. The first of these was Project Sign in 1947. This was a little bit like the X-Files, a joint group of military men and scientists who investigated a total of 273 UFO reports seeking any signs of extraterrestrial activity, and concluded that they all had some perfectly rational explanation. Nevertheless, a small group of this commission did believe that some UFOs could be due to spaceships from other worlds. The first was the Mantle UFO incident, when a young captain named Thomas Mantle chased a UFO with his plane. Unfortunately, he ended up crashing and dying in that pursuit. The second was the Gorman dogfight, in which pilot George Gorman saw a Foo Fighter overflying Fargo. And the third was the Chills-witted UFO encounter, when 2 commercial pilots saw a shiny object as they flew over Alabama. According to the group's investigation, the first 2 cases were actually sightseeings of skyhook balloons, while the third was a meteorite. By the way, the committee which allegedly investigated all of this was known as Majestic 12, since it was comprised by 12 government high-ups. At the time, there was some concern that all these UFO reports were actually planes from the Soviet Union, similar to the ones developed by the Horton brothers. In 1948, Project Sign became Project Grudge, and its purpose shifted towards investigating UFO phenomena, but under the premise that they were not extraterrestrial flying sources. Lastly, perhaps the most famous of these initiatives was Project Blue Book, established in 1952 by Charles P. Cable and headed by the US Air Force Captain Edward Ruppelt. And the idea was to determine whether or not UFO represented a danger for national security. An astronomer named Joseph Allen Hynek was the consultant for the project and one of its notable members. In fact, there is even a TV series about Project Blue Book, and he is the main protagonist, interpreted by Eileen Gillen, or Littlefinger from Game of Thrones. After gathering more than 12,000 reports, in 1969 the project concluded that the vast majority of UFO incidents were either misinterpretations of natural phenomena or aircraft sightings. Many others were considered frauds, and just around 6% were labeled unexplained.
I still think it's pretty fishy, Batman.
Incidentally, it was Captain Ruppelt who decided to rename flying saucers as UFOs, unidentified flying objects. He published a book in 1956 which recounted his experience studying UFOs, and basically concluded that none of them were alien spaceships. As an interesting point, there are also less well-known marine phenomena called USOs, unidentified submerged objects, but that's a story for another episode. Meanwhile, Hynek the astronomer developed the concept of close encounters. He described 3 kinds of encounters with presences from another world. Encounters of the first kind, including the visual sightings of unidentified flying objects in the sky. Encounters on the second kind would require some physical evidence of a UFO, including interference with machinery, impressions on the ground, and that kind of thing. And the third kind would be an encounter with a UFO in which an animated entity was present. Later, some additional types were added, including the fourth, which were simple abductions. The fifth would be telepathic contact. The sixth, when a UFO or alien caused the death of a human or an animal. The seventh would involve the creation of an alien hybrid. The eighth include permanent contact with an alien entity, and finally the ninth would be a complete abduction, in which the victim is tortured and eventually killed.
That's a terrible ending.
In 1949, True magazine published an article written by Donald Kehoe, a former aviator in the US Marine Corps, who said that UFOs were 100% real. Evidently, this caused a great commotion. And then to make matters worse, the following year Kehoe wrote the book with the unimaginative title of The Flying Saucers Are Real, which sold more than 500,000 copies. A little later, in July 1952, there were several UFO sightings near Washington DC's National Airport on 2 consecutive weekends. At the time, they were explained as a natural phenomenon of temperature inversion, but this didn't convince anyone and lots of people panicked. Partly in response to the public mood, the CIA created the Robertson Panel, comprised by scientists, physicists, meteorologists, engineers, and astronomers, and headed by Dr. H.P. Robertson, a physicist from Caltech. The committee spent a long time reviewing all the documentation from Project Blue Book, and concluded that the entire UFO business was a bunch of malarkey. Its recommendation to the Air Force was to play down this business, and perhaps even conduct discrediting and ridicule campaigns in the media in order to stifle the public interest. In addition, they also advised keeping an eye on groups of conspiracy nuts, as they did have a big influence in many credulous souls. Several strange cases were explained as fault fractures, oil and gas prospecting, and the release of ethylene and other gases, since tectonic movements often cause light effects in the sky. In addition, many of those gases tend to cause hallucinations. In fact, ethylene is thought to be the very same gas that the soothsayers in the Oracle of Delphi used to enter trances and view the future. Or, just to get high, depending on your perspective.
What are you implying? Not implying, stating.
The thing is that, following the committee's recommendation, the leadership of Project Blue Book shifted its main focus, from serious UFO investigations to PR activities aimed at discrediting the whole issue. Frustrated by this change of direction, Captain Ruppelt left in 1953, but Hynek the astronomer stayed until the end. In the initial years of the research, Hynek had been skeptical and argued that most UFO reports had a perfectly rational explanation. However, although he had never seen a flying object himself, he gradually opened up his mind, and after many years of investigative work, reached the conclusion that there were some genuinely unexplainable cases. Hynek always advocated for a rigorous scientific approach to investigating these phenomena, and although he never totally ruled out the extraterrestrial origin hypothesis, he didn't promote it openly either. Because of his extremely rigorous approach, when the project took a new direction, Hynek began to experience considerable friction with the military heads. He disagreed with their methods and conclusions, and they in turn blocked his proposals, since they were most interested in finding the quickest possible answer in order to get rid of the press.
There are many things of importance, some more than others.
In 1972, Hynek told his experience at Project Blue Book and his investigations in the UFO Experience. And later in 1977, he made a cameo in Steven Spielberg's cult classic, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. You can see him right here. Hey, Dr. Hynek! Over in Britain, they also had their share of UFO reports, and that led the government to found the Flying Saucer Working Party in 1950. This 5-member committee concluded that out of the hundreds of cases investigated, only 3 were difficult to explain, although they eventually decided that they could have been optical effects and said that all the talk about UFOs was pure rubbish. It would be another 45 years before the follow-up study was undertaken, codenamed Project Condign, and which confirmed the previous findings, that the main causes of UFO reports were misidentification of man-made objects and natural phenomena. Yeah, how boring. With all this excitement, B-movies about Martians and such stuff were in full swing. From 1951, we have The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Man from Planet X, and The Thing from Another World, which was the first version of the famous The Thing, remade several years later by John Carpenter. One of our favorite films in the channel, by the way. From 1953, we can highlight the first film adaptation of The War of the Worlds, which Spielberg would try his hand almost half a century later. The first Invaders of Mars is also from that year. Sometime later, in the second half of the 1950s, among many others, we can point to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Earth vs. Flying Saucers, Forbidden Planet, It, The Terror from Beyond Space, The Blob, and Plan 9 from Outer Space, a little gem from crappy B cinema. All of these contributed to expand the American collective imagination regarding the Cold War all over the world, including the myths about UFOs and extraterrestrials. In fact, UFO sighting reports began to pop up all over the planet.
How many people have you told?
To be clear, many of those reports were real. People did see things, even if they didn't know what those things were. However, there was also a lot of made-up crap, with some folks saying that they had been contacted by extraterrestrials in order to gain popularity. Since back then, all these testimonies were immediately picked up by the press and TV, as there were always plenty of fanatics wanting to hear more about UFO cases. And of course, the weirder, the better. Add to this the usual cadre of fraudsters, attention seekers desperate for the 15 minutes of fame, and straight up mental cases, and we have the perfect cocktail for UFO reports appearing left, right and center. Among such reports, we have the case of George Adamski, a Polish immigrant who ran a restaurant in California. For starters, he swore that he had seen multiple cigar-shaped UFOs since the late 1940s. But the main event came in 1952, when Adamski said that while driving through the desert, he was contacted by tall blonde humanoids. This kind of aliens are known as Nordics, Venusians or Pleiadians, because they supposedly come from the Pleiades, and they are thought to be peaceful and deeply concerned with human affairs following the first atomic detonations. Some even believe that they signed a peace treaty with President Eisenhower in 1955. And well, we must admit that the White House certainly attracts plenty of weirdos. Back to Adamski, he said that he communicated telepathically with an alien named Orphan and was invited to board a spaceship to go on a tour of several planets in our solar system. Following his experience, Adamski published various books like Flying Saucers Have Landed, which became a bestseller at the time. In them, Adamski included supposed photographs of UFOs, although many of them appear to be complete fabrications, like the top part of the surgical lamp and stuff like that. But one way or another, this prototype of UFO became ingrained in popular culture. Around that time, an air mechanic named George Van Tassel held a UFO-themed gathering in his aerodrome in California. This was the Giant Rock Spaceship Convention held in the Mojave Desert, which soon became an annual event. At these conventions, UFO fans exchanged their ideas on aliens and the impending New Age. It turns out that Tassel was a huge enthusiast of the esoteric world who lived next to a giant rock with his meditation group. He recounted that one day an alien taught him how to rejuvenate by constructing the Integratron, a structure that could extend human life. Unfortunately, he died before he could complete it.
Can you appreciate the irony?
Meanwhile, all throughout the 1950s, the US government continued running multiple projects to develop super advanced aircraft, many of which were shaped just like flying saucers. The best known case is the Avro car, built in 1953. This circular jet aircraft, which probably inspired the Jetsons vehicle, didn't quite work as planned. The story goes that the blueprints from this thing were stolen from Nazi engineers at a farm in Prague. And then of course we have to consider that some images of these experimental machines were altered, like this one, which has been reproduced everywhere. As was mentioned before, there were several attempts to improve on the designs created by the Horton brothers for a flying wing aircraft. The most notable were the Northrop YB-35 and the Northrop YB-49, which were tested in the late 1940s, but various technical problems led the production to be cancelled. Supersonic flying wing designs were then set aside for a while, until the 80s, when some engineers realized that the features were ideal to avoid radar dissection. This led to the development of the Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. And it's also worth mentioning that one of the Horton brothers, who had sought refuge in Argentina, developed jet fighters for that government, such as the IAE-37 Flying Wing. As we said, throughout the 50s there were innumerable cases of UFO reports, so we won't go into every single one of them. For example, we have the Lubbock Lights in Texas, which featured some unusual light formation seen by many people. This incident was explained as being caused by a migrating flock of plover birds which reflected the lights of some recently installed vapor streetlights. This doesn't make complete sense, and so many people believe that it was all the government trying to cover up a test flight of some secret aircraft. Another case was the Mariana UFO incident in August 1950, which took place in Great Falls, Montana. One day, Nick Mariana, manager of a baseball team, saw a group of flying objects and recorded the behavior on a 16mm camera which he carried in his car. This was later confiscated by the army, who erased most of his recording, explaining that what he had seen was really a reflection of two F-94 fighter planes. One of the most curious incidents was the Flatwoods Monster. This happened in West Virginia in 1952, when one night several people from Braxton County saw a shiny object traverse the sky and land at a local farm. A group of them went over to see what the heck was going on, and when they arrived, their flashlights revealed a tall, monstrous figure with a pointy red face and claw-like extremities. They all fled immediately and the creature was never seen again. Subsequent investigations concluded that the light had been produced by a meteor entering the atmosphere and that supposed alien was probably an owl sitting in a tree. From 1953, we have the Kinross incident. In this case, a US Air Force pilot named Felix Moncla chased the UFO he had located on his radar until they both disappeared suddenly and mysteriously over Lake Superior. The explanation given in this case was that the UFO was a plane from the Canadian Air Force, but the Canadians denied this. The prevailing theory is that Moncla's plane crashed into Lake Superior, but all we know for sure is that he was never found. A similar case to Flatwoods took place in the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter at a farm in Kentucky in August 1955. That night, 7 adults and 3 children from the same family said that they had photo of a bunch of small aliens who had sieged their home. The grown-ups had shot at these beings when they appeared suddenly looking through their windows. The creatures were described as small, with pointy ears and clawed hands, and with very shiny yellow eyes. Apparently, some media outlets reported the small aliens as being green, and that led to the explosive popularity of the little green men. By the way, the explanation given for this event was the presence of curious horned owls, combined with a little dose of collective hysteria, and perhaps a large one of homemade liquor. And by the way, this event is thought to have inspired the movie Critters. And now we're going to wrap up with what is considered the first alien abduction in history, or at least the first documented case. Unexpectedly, this didn't happen in the USA, but in Brazil, and this is the case of Antonio Vilas Boas. On the night of the 16th of October 1957, this 23-year-old farmer was minding his own business on his field at Minas Gerais when all of a sudden a UFO landed next to him. From it descended a group of aliens wearing spacesuits with big blue eyes and measuring around 1.5 meters. That's 5 feet for the metrically challenged. The aliens seized Antonio and dragged him into their spaceship, where they conducted strange experiments on him. Next, a very beautiful and very naked female alien proceeded to sexually use and abuse him. And finally, once the ETs had satisfied their curiosity and lust, they left him back at his farm and departed. According to the most commonly accepted theory, Antonio spent a night at a brothel, receiving a good old-fashioned SM. Perhaps not quite as exciting, but then again, life rarely is.
How disappointing.
The first famous UFO case in the 1960s was the Hill abduction. Betty and Barney Hill were an American couple who lived happily in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. On the night of the 19th of September 1961, as they were driving home, they noticed a shiny light in the sky. They stopped the car to observe it better and quickly realized that it was a saucer-shaped UFO. The thing came towards them, and the Hills were then able to see several humanoid shapes staring at them through the spaceship portholes. At that moment, the Hills became telepathically aware that the aliens wanted to abduct them, so they jumped in the car and fled. However, they soon began to hear an unbearable screeching sound which made them fall unconscious. Later, they woke up with fragmented memories and the feeling that a long time had passed, as if the brains had been scrambled.
I suffer from short-term memory loss.
When they informed officials at the nearby Peace Air Force Base, they were told not to worry, that all they had seen was planet Jupiter, perhaps combined with some unusual atmospheric effects, and maybe a few martinis. Still, Betty was not convinced, so she contacted Major Donald Kehoe. You might recall him from the previous episode, a retired military officer who is now the head of the NICAP, a UFO research organization. Around this time, plenty of civilian groups and associations linked to UFOs were being founded, including MUFON in 1969 or the British Bufora in 1962. Regarding the hills, Betty told Kehoe about the horrible nightmares she had every night, as well as her perception that strange things happened around her. Added to this was the fact that Barney began to suffer a horrible depression. Eventually, in an attempt to unlock some memories of the abduction, Kehoe recommended that the hills should undergo regressive hypnosis. So in 1964, Dr. Benjamin Simmons began with the sessions, and soon the hills remembered that a group of 12 aliens had dragged them out of their car and subjected them to all sorts of horrible and invasive experiments. These creatures were described as small, grey, with large heads and huge eyes, and wearing some sorts of uniforms. And as you might expect, after these reports were made public, grey aliens became the new fashion. In addition, Betty also remembered a map she had seen on the spaceship which showed multiple star systems. When she recreated the map, it apparently represented the Zeta Reticuli star system, which is probably why many future abductees cited Zeta Reticuli as the origin of their aliens, leading them to be known as Reticulians. The Hills case became very famous, partly due to the numerous interviews they did, but also thanks to The Interrupted Journey, a bestseller based on the story published by John Fuller in 1966.
So boring.
Many people did doubt the whole business and said that the Hills probably imagined it all, perhaps under the stress of being an interracial couple, quite unusual in the USA back then. But they always maintained that they hadn't suffered any problems in that regard. Furthermore, researcher Martin Cotmere suggested that those memories retrieved under hypnosis might have been influenced by an episode of The Outer Limits, which had been broadcast a couple of weeks ago before the session, specifically the one titled The Bolero Shield, as it appears to have several points in common with the reports. It is a well-known fact that this type of hypnotic treatments often generates false memories, based on involuntary suggestions from the therapist or the person's subconscious. Meanwhile, in the 1960s, the US Air Force continued to run plenty of secret experimental aircraft operations. We could mention the development of the Lockheed SR-71, better known as the Blackbird, a long-range surveillance aircraft capable of reaching Mach 3, which is 3 times the speed of sound. And the US government didn't only conduct experiments with aircrafts, but also with people. We are talking, of course, about the infamous Project MKUltra, which was supposed to be a top-secret operation run jointly with the CIA in an attempt to control human minds, develop telekinesis, and all sorts of stuff. It is said that they experimented on human beings, including torture techniques and all sorts of drugs that induced altered states of consciousness. Kids, don't do drugs. We're not going to start delving into this subject because it requires an entire video of its own, but if you do believe in any of these, then perhaps you shouldn't read The Catcher in the Rye, as rumors said that the passages from this novel were used to activate hypnotic commands in the subjects.
Kill John Lennon! Kill John Lennon! Kill John Lennon! Kill John Lennon!
And now let's travel to Montana, specifically the Milestone Air Force Base, where they monitor nuclear warheads and where in 1967 an unusual UFO case took place. It all began when the personnel at the base observed some lights performing strange maneuvers in the night sky. The entire base was put on alert, and they soon realized that the 10-Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile that they were in charge of had suddenly become deactivated. Whoopsie. Fortunately, as fast as everything had started, it was all over. The flying lights vanished and it all became calm. Since there was no consequences, the incident was classified as top secret and quietly swept under the rug.
Is there anything else I can do for you?
At the same time, science fiction TV series were becoming increasingly popular. The Twilight Zone began airing in 1959 and was soon followed by The Outer Limits in 1963. I loved both, and if you want to watch them, many episodes really hold up well. That same year, the BBC began to broadcast its classic series Doctor Who, and then 1966 saw the premiere of Star Trek, which eventually became a massive franchise, and nowadays a bunch of rubbish in my honest opinion. Now, back to ufology. In those days, grisly new types of phenomena began to take place. Animal mutilations. The first case widely reported by the media was that of Snippy the horse in Alamosa, Colorado, 1967. Its owners found the poor animal dead with lots of precise cuts all over its body and with its head and neck completely devoid of any meat. And to make it stranger, there was no blood at the scene, as if it had all been absorbed somehow. The press soon found many more similar cases with dead sheep and cows. Some blamed cryptid monsters, aka legendary creatures, like the chupacabra from South American fables. But of course it took about 1 nanosecond before everyone started crying out, "Alien experiments!" Now let's talk about the Kecksburg UFO incident. This took place on the night of December 9th, 1965 at Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, when hundreds of people saw a large fireball crossing the skies. Then eyewitnesses at the small town of Kecksburg reported that the object had crashed at the nearby forest. According to these witnesses, the UFO was shaped like a bell or an acorn. The army quickly cordoned off the area and later explained that it had just been a meteorite impact. Nevertheless, it appears that some people found pieces of metal scattered around the area, leading to theories that what really crashed there was a Soviet plane or an artificial satellite, specifically the Cosmos 96. Others believe it was the continuation of the Nazi Flying Bell project, conducted in secret by the US.
Good one.
2 years later, in January 1967, we have the abduction of Betty Andreessen, a lady who lived in South Ashburnham, Massachusetts, together with her 7 children. One night, as her parents were visiting, all the lights in the house suddenly went off, and as they gathered in the kitchen, they saw a bright pink light shining through one of the windows. Afterwards, they also saw what looked like small creatures walking around the house. The next day, everything appeared normal, but from that day onwards, Betty began to have visions and nightmares in which she saw threatening humanoid creatures. A decade later, in 1977, she decided to undergo hypnosis in order to find out what the heck had happened that night. And it turned out that after seeing the night visitors, the entire family had been paralyzed by aliens who had entered the house and abducted them. They were all taken aboard a spaceship and subjected to strange experiments, and afterwards the alien flew them back to their planet, where Betty said that she had met God himself, no less. Apparently, he told Betty that she had been chosen for a very important mission, and that those aliens were in charge of helping humanity to overcome their self-destructive tendencies. However, judging by our current state of affairs, we have to conclude that either the aliens were a bunch of incompetents, or that Betty was high on something other than life.
What the hell have you people been smoking out there?
By the late 1960s, new theories had begun to arise regarding the origins of UFOs. The whole business of extraterrestrial origins had been thoroughly explored, so around that time, certain authors such as John Keel, a journalist from New York, and Jacques Vallée, a French astronomer, put forward that these beings came from another dimension. The interdimensional hypothesis sought to connect ufology with all sorts of paranormal themes: ghosts, cryptozoological creatures, premonitions, telepathy, devil's possessions, vampirism, animal mutilations, you name it. According to Keel's book, Operation Trojan Horse, the objective of these UFOs was to confuse us human beings. He said that in reality, UFOs were just a deception which sought to influence and manipulate the collective imagination. And for that reason, many classical ufologists consider Keel as a heretic. For his part, Vallée maintained a paraphysical hypothesis explained in his book Passport to Magonia from 1969. According to this version, aliens from a parallel dimension came here in the UFOs, and the humans who saw their manifestation associated them with other phenomena from popular folklore all over the world, including elves, gnomes, genies, succubus, etc. All of these were embodiments from another dimension that had been adapted to the culture and beliefs of the people who witnessed them. This issue of adapting things to our own belief is actually very interesting. Remember the case of Kenneth Arnold? If you recall, he said that he had seen boomerang-shaped UFOs. But he never mentioned anything about flying saucers, rather that they moved like a saucer skipping over water. Well, the thing is that many journalists misinterpreted the statement and reported that the flying objects were shaped as saucers. This mistake was repeated and amplified hundreds of times by the other media, with the result that later, probably influenced by those outlets, most of the UFO sightings were said to be of saucer-shaped objects.
Coincidence? I think not!
For the skeptics, most people were making up these reports based on erroneous information repeated by the press. Even those Vallée's hypotheses claim that these interdimensional phenomena took the shape of whatever the witness has internalized, since they were manifestations and projections of elements from another dimension.
What a beautiful story.
Yeah.
In later decades, these new ways of understanding the phenomenology as well as its rejections gave birth to multiple religions and sects related to aliens. There are countless examples: the Church of Scientology, the Unarians in California who await the arrival of an alien fleet, the alien movement in France which says that the Elohim alien gods created us via genetic engineering, the Nubian nation which was founded by a convicted pedophile and in addition to UFOs talks about black racial supremacy. The Typhonian order derived from the beliefs of Aleister Crowley combined with Lovecraftian themes. the One World Family, which mixes the Elohim from the aliens with Christianity and communism. The Figu community in Switzerland, founded by Willy Mayer, who says that he's in contact with an alien civilization known as the Plejaren. The Chen Tao sect in Taiwan, who mixes Buddhism, Taoism and Ufology. Or the Heaven's Gate sect, whose members committed mass suicide in 1997 because they believed that a passing spaceship would take their souls to another level of existence. And the list just goes on and on and on. Now, where the heck did all these ideas come from? And why are extraterrestrial religions so successful that many of them still endure nowadays? Well, I think in part it's because of the spiritual crisis that the West is currently experiencing, due to the impossibility of finding simple answers that explain our reality, either through most Western religions like Christianity, Judaism or Islam, which says that everything was created by an all-powerful God, or else through science, which has grown extremely complicated and thus out of reach for the general public. Many people seek some sort of answer elsewhere, and eventually some people have found answers in aliens. So it seems that if every single historical enigma could be explained via aliens, a lot of people would probably sleep much better at night. And if to that we add the notion that these creatures are seeking some chosen ones to guide humanity towards salvation, then you definitely hit the jackpot, because everyone likes to feel that they are part of something tremendously big and significant. Talking of this, in 1968, Stanley Kubrick premiered his excellent film 2001: A Space Odyssey. In the opening scene, we see an alien artifact endowing some dumb apes with the power of awareness and evolution, but then the next thing we see is basically the episode of Cain and Abel from the Bible, so it's not entirely clear whether it's a gift or a curse. Anyway, when the protagonist David Bowman sets out to find the extraterrestrial civilization, he's swept up by a whirlwind of luminous spheres and ends up in a Rococo-style chamber symbolizing progress and awakening. Bowman is then reborn as a man of a new era, announced by many esoteric gurus, and in fact this is the message that many New Age adepts extract from the whole affair. So in the end, believing in Martians is the same as believing in almost anything else, a matter of faith, except that in this case it's been adapted to new times and new technologies.
I have been chosen. Farewell, my friends. I go on to a better place.
And now pay attention to this. In 1967, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, U Thant from Burma, said that the UFOs were the second most important problem in the world, after the Vietnam War. And as you can probably imagine, this statement caused a huge commotion. The following year saw the publication of the Condon Report, a project carried out by the University of Colorado and financed by the US Air Force in order to study UFOs. The head of this project was physicist Edward Condon, and his conclusion was basically that the notion that aliens were visiting Earth was highly unlikely, and therefore studying these phenomena would be a waste of scientific resources. As a result, Project Blue Book was finally dismantled. With this, we reached the year 1969, when the Apollo 11 mission reached the moon. Neil Armstrong became the first person to ever set foot on our beloved satellite, simultaneously giving rise to plenty of conspiracy theories. For example, that the moon landing was a hoax, recorded at Hollywood studios and directed by Stanley Kubrick, or that there were cuts during the transmission because the astronauts saw humanoid creatures hiding around them and they were edited out by the broadcast. Now we jump forward to 1975 to talk about the case of an American logger named Travis Walton. One evening, after spending his day cutting down trees in Snowflake, Arizona, together with 7 other guys, Walton was on his way back home when he reportedly was abducted by a flying saucer covered in shiny lights. His colleagues informed the police, but this ended up working against them because the cops thought that they had made the whole thing up and accused them of homicide. A search and rescue mission was launched, and after 5 days, Walton appeared next to a phone booth, completely naked, and said that he had indeed been abducted by aliens who had conducted all sorts of strange experiments on him. According to his story, there were some grey aliens who were a bunch of assholes, but thankfully there were other Nordic-looking ones who helped him and finally returned him to Earth. The FBI tried hooking him to a polygraph, and although he failed the first test, it later appeared that he was saying the truth. But as you probably know, these kind of tests are not really reliable. Regardless, the guy made a lot of money with his book The Walton Experience, and also with the subsequent film released in 1993. By the way, this case inspired a psychologist named Susan Clancy to investigate the number of reported abductions in the following days to the broadcast of the documentaries and the films reported to the subject, and she found out that such cases increased by 2,500%. She explained all about this in her new book, which was titled Abducted. Guess she wasn't really inspired that day.
What a coincidence!
Around that time, Steven Spielberg released his iconic Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It was a golden age for ufology, since there was constant talk about aliens and conspiracy theories in the media. One interesting example is Project Zerpo, which believed that the events portrayed at the end of the film about a group of humans departing with the aliens like college students during a year abroad was absolutely real. According to this theory, in 1965, the US government agreed to send 12 military officers with the aliens back to their planet of origin, Zerpo. Once they arrived, they found out that there was a war going on between different alien races, and even some humans were killed during the mission.
That's the craziest thing I've ever bloody heard.
Cases of UFO collective hysteria were not exclusive to the US. The Soviet Union also had the fair share, but these were far less publicized due to the regime's secrecy. For example, in 1977 we have the Petrozavodsk phenomenon, when hundreds of witnesses saw bright lights moving across the sky. Authorities said that this had been due to the launch of the Cosmos 955 satellite, but that explanation didn't satisfy everyone, including several scientists from the Soviet Academy of Science, who investigated the case but didn't reach any definitive conclusion. There's also Kapustin Yar Soviet rocket range, located near Volgograd in the former Stalingrad. This Soviet secret base was known as the Russian Roswell, or Russian Area 51, since it was believed to have been built around the crashed UFO in order to carry out secret experiments with new weapons created by reverse engineering alien technology. And as you might expect, plenty of UFO sightings were reported in the area around that time.
Madness, mass hysteria, delusion.
Meanwhile, in Spain, there were also several famous UFO cases in the 1970s. For instance, we have the Galdar UFO incident of 1976, which took place in the Canary Islands. And according to the reports, hundreds of eyewitnesses, including the sailors of a Spanish Navy corvette, saw a bright source of light rising up into the sky, followed by a massive red flash. The explanation given was that this had been a test launch of Poseidon missiles by an American submarine which had been conducting NATO maneuvers. But the strangest part of the case is that at the same time, a doctor named Francisco Padrón swore he had seen a transparent sphere floating around with two strange creatures inside it, wearing red uniforms while he was riding a taxi.
You don't believe me?
In 1977, there's a story that multiple spaceships landed in Gallarta, near my native region of Vizcaya. Out of it came a group of Martians who explained to a woodworker named Juan Sillero that the Earth was deviating from its orbit, so they wanted to help humanity restore it. Sillero said that he made the aliens 5 times, but both the military and the Ivan Collective, a group of UFO researchers, concluded that it all had been some sort of hoax, and that Sillero suffered psychiatric issues. But perhaps the most famous case was the one which took place in Manises on the 11th of November 1979. In this case, a Spanish airplane flying from Austria to the Canary Islands came across a UFO full of shining and blinking lights, which began to follow it. The pilots freaked out and requested permission to land in Manises Airport in Valencia, while the Air Force dispatched a fighter jet to intercept the UFO. However, the UFO then bust off under the incredulous look of Captain Fernando Cámara. An investigation was conducted, but the Spanish government never gave any details about the event. The rumor said that the lights may have been reflected flares from the combustion towers of the Escombreras refinery, located nearby in Cartagena, but the pilot was adamant that this was impossible. And just to close the issue in Spanish UFOs, my own grandfather also said that he had seen one in Puente la Reina in 1960, which is where my mother's family spent their summer vacations. But as far as I know, in this case he was the only witness, so unfortunately there isn't much more to tell.
You are insane, just as your grandfather is insane.
In the late 1970s, a new kind of alien manifestation started to become popular, crop circles or agroglyphs to use the technical term. If you've watched Mel Gibson's film Signs, you'll know what we're talking about. All of a sudden, strange designs started to appear in crop fields all over the world. These were quickly attributed to space landings or interpreted as encrypted messages from extraterrestrials. Regardless, these kinds of markings have actually been showing up for a very long time. It is thought that the first one, known as the Moen Devil, appeared in 1678. It was called that because back then these phenomena, like almost everything out of the usual, were blamed on demons. In the modern age, the first of these phenomena took place in 1966 in Queensland, Australia, but it was in the late 1970s that crop circles began to pop up right, left and center, especially in sunny Britain. Disappointingly, in 1991, artists Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley confessed that they were responsible for most of the circles that appeared in England in the previous decade, more than 200, and they even showed how they managed to make these marks using simple wood planks and some ropes. The thing is that even after the confessions, the number of cases didn't go down. On the contrary, sorry, they multiplied. But then again, it's easy to see how many artists would view this as creating beautiful public works, which got plenty of attention from the media, kind of like graffiti. We've now arrived at the two final decades of the 20th century, when the space craze ramped up. For starters, US President Jimmy Carter said that he himself had seen a UFO, and his successor Ronald Reagan mentioned alien invasion several times in his speeches.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? What could be more alien to the universal aspirations of our peoples than war and the threat of war?
During the 1980s Christmas season, we have the Rattlesham Forest UFO incident in a town in East England. This is considered the most famous UFO incident occurred in the UK, to the point that it's even referred as the British Roswell. The story goes that a lot of people at that town observed inexplicable lights moving around the sky, and they also said that they saw triangular objects land at a nearby forest. As it turns out, just at the other side of that forest were two military bases, Bentwaters and Woodbridge. A military patrol was sent to inspect the forest just in case an aircraft had crashed or something like that, but what they saw were another bunch of lights moving around very quickly. After the UFO disappeared on the horizon, the patrols examined the site and they said that they found some sort of triangular landing marks as well as plenty of broken branches. The next day they returned to the site and once again saw the lights moving around the sky. Base Commander Charles Holt ordered the patrol vehicles to follow them, and this conversation was recorded in a microcassette device. You can even listen to the whole thing on the corresponding Wikipedia page. The British Ministry of Defense denied that the event was related to a UFO, instead saying that this was all been due to the reflections from a lighthouse located on the coast 8 kilometers away, and the burnt ground markings and branches were explained as being caused by foresters who had been working in the area. The explanation baffled many people who considered that they were being taken for fools by a government which was covering up the truth, and so it ended up generating even more noise in the media.
You can't handle the truth!
In Argentina, we have the famous Cerro Uritorco, a place that has been linked to mysterious and esoteric legends, including the appearance of lights in the sky. It seems that, in 1983, a certain Angel Acoglanis said that this was the location of a subterranean alien city called Urx, which according to him, will serve as a refuge when the world-ending cataclysm arrives. Returning to the US, in Christmas 1985, a writer named Whitley Strieber said that he had been abducted by extraterrestrials. As he told in his book Communion, published in 1989, he was sleeping peacefully at his home in New York State when he was woken by a group of aliens who took him to the spaceship. He calls them visitors because he doesn't really make it clear whether they come from another world or a different dimension, or maybe they were weird creatures from Earth. But anyway, Strieber said that they conducted all sorts of strange medical experiments on him, gave him a lollipop for being a brave boy and not crying, and then returned him back home. The book was so successful that it was even adapted into a film, with Christopher Walken as a protagonist no less.
Go to hell.
And now we finally reached the topic that all you alien lovers have been waiting for, the famous Area 51. This secret military base, also known as Groom Lake, Dreamland or the Ranch, is located in the state of Nevada, slightly north of Las Vegas, within the Nellis military complex. Obviously, its location is not particularly secret, seeing as everyone knows where it is, but regarding what the heck goes on in there, well, that's a different matter. The most common idea is that the premises of Area 51 are a training and testing field for experimental aircraft. In fact, the base has a gigantic aerodrome, and ever since it began operating back in the 1950s, people nearby have always reported seeing strange lights in the skies. These were most likely test flights, but of course nothing that goes on in there is made public by the US government. In fact, until 1995 they didn't even admit Area 51 existed at all. All of that secrecy, perhaps absurd and exaggerated, had led many conspiracy nuts to believe that the base is used to research UFOs and that they even keep actual aliens there. The more likely truth is that the location was chosen because it's ideal to conduct tests with experimental machinery. It is far away from many large towns, which makes it more private. It has great weather all around the year, and it's easy to supply, run and maintain in working order. The only thing that might have been lacking slightly was the runway, but it was extended, so no problem there either. Back in the day, the place was used to test nuclear devices, and the sector in which the base was built was number 51, thus the name. Some of the tests that we know were conducted there include the Lockheed U-2 aircraft around 1955. This was known as Project Aquitone and was run by the CIA. Later in the 1960s, they conducted Project Oxguard, which included the development of the Lockheed A-12 and the SR-71 models, aircrafts that were capable of reaching Mach 3 speeds. In the 1970s, we can mention a prototype of stealth aircraft known as Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk. This was a spy plane designed to be invisible to enemy's radar and used to locate defensive systems, command bases, and similar sites. In the 1980s, the base was rumored to house Project SR-91 Aurora, although this hasn't been fully declassified. This will involve a hypothetical aircraft capable of reaching Mach 5. But what we're interested in took place in 1989, the year when the base exploded in popularity. The key figure in this story was Bob Lazar, a guy who claimed he had worked in Area 51 as a physicist between 1988 and 1989, specifically in Sector 4. After going public, Lazar did an interview with journalist George Knapp on a Las Vegas TV station KLSA-TV. By the way, Knapp was a huge fan of paranormal business and was always featuring some weird thing or another in his program. According to Lazar, the premise is a Sector 4 housed a reverse engineering project. They were studying UFOs of extraterrestrial origins in order to learn and apply their technology. Lazar swore that he had seen up to 9 different kinds of flying saucers throughout his time there. He also said that those alien beings had been visiting humanity for at least 10,000 years, and that they were small, grey, and they came from the Zeta Reticuli system. He even explained in detail a theory about how the UFO worked, going into details about their engines and propulsion systems in a way that seems to make sense in connection to many UFO sightings. The main issue here is that the government never recognized him as a former employee, and to make it worse, the 2 universities where Lazar said he had studied, MIT and CIT, have no records of his attendance. Anyway, back to our story. Time passed, the 80s turned into the 90s, and aliens gradually fell out of the limelight. The multiple ufology conventions which took place in the US also saw attendance decline year after year. In their place, conspiracy theories began to propagate through the first internet forums, slowly growing and becoming more popular. One of the best known is that of Dulce Base in the New Mexico desert. The story says that it's a subterranean alien base where humans and extraterrestrials collaborate in terrible experiments. The origin of this myth traces back to Paul Benowitz, a former Coast Guard radio engineer in World War II. In the late 70s, he said that he had intercepted a strange conversation from Dulce's base talking about these aliens. It must be said that the guy had been very interested in ufology for a very long time. Sometime later, in 1995, a man named Philip Schneider reported that he had worked in the base in the 70s, and that he had been an eyewitness of the Dulce's base disaster. Allegedly, in 1976, a group of aliens rebelled against the humans in the underground base, and there was a bloody battle which took the lives of 60 people. If this story sounds vaguely familiar, it's because it's thought to have inspired many famous works, including the video game Half-Life. Another type of alien that became popular at this time were the Reptilians, especially after the huge success in the 80s of the TV series V, my favorite as a kid by the way, and also fueled by the Anunnaki theories of Zecharia, Sitchin and David Icke. David Icke was an English sport broadcaster who worked at the BBC and also acted as a spokesperson for the Green Party. In 1991, after a medium told him he was destined for a high purpose, he went a bit potty and started saying that he was the descendant of an arcane deity who had informed him that the world would end very soon. The public ridiculed him, but Icke went ahead and published several books in which he refuted the totalitarian ideas of the modern world, and which were also seasoned with plenty of New Age themes. According to Icke, humanity is being controlled by a secret group of reptilians known as the Babylonian Brotherhood. Furthermore, he said that these creatures were shapeshifters, and many famous influential figures were actually reptilians, including Elizabeth II and George Bush. Their purpose was to keep humanity scared in order to feed off the negative energy, which is why they secretly fueled wars and conflicts all over the planet. Personally, I don't think we need any help from aliens. We're perfectly capable of making a mess of things by ourselves. This is quite similar to John Carpenter's film They Live from '88, in which a race of aliens pretend to be humans in order to subjugate us through subliminal messages. All of this craziness served as a breeding ground for a series that we love here at The Rest is History, The X-Files, which premiered in 1993 and was an instant hit. The following year came Stargate, but this one was more about sci-fi adventuring rather than mysterious conspiracy theories. In terms of feature films, we can spend hours talking about the 80s and 90s. Think E.T., The Thing, Alien, Predator, Contact, The Fifth Element, Independence Day, Starship Troopers, Mars Attacks, Men in Black, The Faculty, Species, Extro, and the list goes on and on and on.
It's all lies, but they're entertaining lies.
Now, in terms of sightings, in 1994 we have the aerial school UFO incident in Rwanda, Zimbabwe, when a group of kids saw a flying saucer landing in the schoolyard. Several aliens came out of it and said hello and then departed. Obviously, the kids were hyper excited, and when they were asked to draw what happened, all produced similar results. Another significant event were the Phoenix Lights in Arizona in 1997. On this occasion, thousands of inhabitants witnessed a V-shaped UFO flying over the city. A little bit later, 9 luminous balls were also seen floating around for a while and then became totally still, hanging in the sky for several minutes. Without a doubt, the Phoenix Lights was the UFO case with most eyewitnesses and also the best documented, since the events were recorded by many people. But the US Air Force immediately said that it had all been a military maneuver conducted with a special aircraft, specifically a Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt, and that the lights were signal flares. All was under control, no reason to worry, nothing special to see here. Come on, move along, sir.
You don't believe in any conspiracy theory? You just think the government's just batting 1,000 and telling us the whole truth?
In recent years, documentary series such as Ancient Aliens have renewed public interest in alien conspiracies, although nowhere near as much as in the 50s and 60s, when these phenomena were followed with great interest and even paranoia. For instance, in 2019 we must mention an assault in Area 51, when thousands of youngsters gathered around the place, running towards the perimeter Naruto style, with a vague notion along the lines of, if we all rush at the same time, they won't be able to stop us. But in the end, nobody had the guts to go all the way. And then we have the business of the Umo and the Umenites. They originated in Spain in the 60s, where several reports began to surface from people who said that they had received messages from a very advanced civilization located in the distant planet of Umo. However, in the mid-1990s, engineer José Luis Jordán Peña admitted that he had made it all up. How disappointing. In a different vein, the Bible translation by Italian Mauro Biglino also followed the line of Sitchin, who is currently in fashion again. But to be honest, his neo-Anunnaki tales have more plot holes than the Fast and the Furious saga.
Some things you just have to take on faith.
In recent years, the White House has declassified several reports of UFO sightings by military pilots. The first of these was a FLIR infrared video recorded in 2004 by carrier group USS Nimitz while deployed off the southern coast of California. Then in 2014 and 2015 we have the gimbal and go fast video recordings, when UFOs were spotted by combat pilots from the USS Roosevelt while operating in the eastern coast of the USA. This pretty much forced the American government to officially admit the existence of UFOs. However, let's make something very clear. A UFO doesn't necessarily entail aliens, but simply what the name describes, an unidentified flying object. What also became very clear is that the Pentagon takes the issue of possible aerial threats extremely seriously, whatever their origin. And in order to address this, they created the AITIP, or Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. In addition, the SCTI initiative, or Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, has been scoring our heavens for decades, using the most advanced radio telescopes in search for an alien signal. Please notice that all the devices seeking intelligent life point away from Earth. That says a lot. And finally, this year, UFOs were back in the limelight after alleged Chinese balloon spy probes were shot down. However, many people believe that it was all a smokescreen. Could it be that we're about to hear a public declaration about the existence of creatures from another world who have been visiting our planets for decades? Nobody really knows, but perhaps we will soon.
And the rest is history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a big like. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video. And the rest is history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a big like. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.
And that is pretty much it for today. In the next episode we'll learn more about alien abductions, and we'll also make a careful approach to the uber famous Area 51 and all its mysteries.
And the rest is history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a big like. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video. And the rest is history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a big like. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.